Another day, another Uber scandal. Today's allegations come from the New York Times and involve Uber's use of a grayball tool to use phone metadata collected by Uber to target officials in areas where Uber was restricted and to prevent them from using the app. Here to explain how tools like this work and whether or not they're legal is our favorite security expert, Iain Thomson from the Register. Welcome back to the show, Iain.
Hello there, Megan. Thanks for having me.
So your Register colleague, Sean Nichols, wrote that when enough signals were raised flagging an Uber user as a cop, Uber enables grayball mode for their account, which would present the user with a ghost car that then would never show up. The Times says this was approved by Uber's legal department. But do we know if a tool like this is actually legal or not?
Well, that's a question I think Uber are going to be finding out the hard way, because if you actually look at this tool, I'm amazed that their legal department actually cleared this, because what they're saying is, well, these people conflict with our terms of service, which include setting up secret stings against our operatives. Actually, no, these were policemen enforcing the law of the land, and I'm not quite sure that Uber's terms of service can be allowed to trump the law of the land when it comes down to it. So I think they're in a very ethically dodgy area at the moment. And I think the first time this comes up to court, they could be facing a very expensive mistake.
Could this be a matter of a kind of a slippery slope? Not to say that it's okay in where it is now, but I could understand possibly someone thinking that a tool something like this would be a good idea if, say, you have a user that has, they have the app installed or whatever, but they've broken those terms of service and repeatedly, or made threats or something like that. So it's like, okay, well then let's make sure that they don't use the service. And then somehow over time that erodes, and the definition of who this can be applied to gets wider and wider, to the point to where it's like, well, but we want to be able to operate in this market, and it's really hard to. So let's apply it to law enforcement as well. Could be something like that.
Well, yes. I mean, when Uber, for example, when Uber went into France, the service was ruled illegal. But the French generally, when it comes to taking direct action to protect labor rights, are very, very hands-on, shall we say. So French taxi drivers were calling up Uber drivers, and then when they turned up, beating them up for being scabs. So I can see that there is a case for blocking users. But what they're doing in this case is saying, right, so when police are trying to shut us down, we will automatically block them out of the system. And this isn't something that they've just been using in one or two markets. This appears to have been done in an awful lot of markets and in countries where parts of Uber services have been ruled illegal, and the police are doing their job in trying to shut it down. And what they're saying is, well, actually, we're not going to go into the legalities of our service, but we're going to set up our terms and conditions so much that we have legal justification for banning these people. Now, that might work if they're banning an individual, but when you're going up against governments like that, then chances are you're going to lose.
Yeah. So what are these signals? Do we know what these signals are that they were sending?
I think it will be based on past history. I mean, obviously, if somebody, one of the things the French police were doing in particular was calling up Uber drivers. The Uber driver would turn up, and then they'd find them and confiscate their vehicle for 24 hours while they checked it out. So that's obviously a huge red flag. But also if they could identify, because we know how Uber is about user data and their willingness to churn through it. So what they could do is identify probable targets and grey those out. They wouldn't want to do too many of them, because that way you could be losing customers. But there are certain indicators, I would have thought, if somebody calls up an Uber and their driver gets fined, or if somebody has called up multiple people from different IPs, that might be an indicator for it. But I think largely this was going on past experience. If we've had a driver pinched, if that expression works over in the US, or arrested or fined for doing Uber work by the police, then the account that called them up is grayed out from there on in.
So we're always constantly sending all kinds of signals to all of these companies all the time. With Uber especially, we recently learned that, we are sending our location information long after we use the app, if we're still using the app. So do you think that things like this grayballing tool could be used for more nefarious reasons, to just block a certain population from using a certain service or app?
It's possible, yes. But if one thing Uber's always been very, very keen on is making money. Sadly, they're not very good at it. In fact, they're losing money hand over fist. But they're not going to want to turn away large numbers of people. Technically, I suppose you could, grey out a particular section of the population based on, I don't know, income or race or gender or whatever. But at the end of the day, Uber is desperately trying to make its business model work. And in order for that to happen, it needs as many paying customers as it can get, and for them to pay slightly more. So it's in their interest really to get the largest number of people using it. I think this was created for a very, very specific purpose, which was where you've got investigators or where you've got police officers who are trying to shut down Uber for operating illegally in their city or state or country. Then this app was, I think, created directly to deal with that problem and very little else.
It really reminds me of, if you remember, a couple of years ago, back when we were not quite so used to hearing bad news about Uber. Godview, which was kind of the portal that employees could really track people who were riding on Uber at all time and see like a live real-time feed. It almost seems like maybe this was, kind of born out of that idea. What I was thinking about when I was kind of reading through this now, yes, granted, Uber is totally under the microscope right now. It seems like everything that Uber does, be it bad or really bad, is getting picked up on and reported, and rightfully so, because there's a lot of really bad stuff out there. But what Uber is doing, and what we're realizing, is that Uber is, really good at tracking users and understanding probably more about its users than the users know or understand that Uber understands about them. How is that different from what all other tech companies are doing? I mean, Google tracks our every move online. This is maybe more in a physical sense when you're talking about Uber. But why is it different? Why is it more, I don't know, more nefarious in this case?
Well, actually, I'm not entirely sure it is. As you rightly point out, Google and other companies do take a phenomenal amount of data about us. I think what's disturbed people about Uber is their willingness to use it for, shall we say, more nefarious purposes. The God mode was a case in point. That was just a clear abrogation. If you tried that in Europe, you'd be in deep, deep trouble with the regulators. But they've also done stuff like, tracking the propensity of people to have one-night stands, for example, based on the data they've got. There's some evidence that the company employees were going through individuals' accounts, particularly if they were famous, and seeing what they were doing. I think what worries a lot of people about Uber is that the company is willing to play fast and loose with the law, both in terms of its business model and possibly also in terms of data. So, I mean, trust is the key element behind all this. People are generally okay with Google going through their data because they see Google as largely trustworthy with it, or they just don't realize and they just want the free services. But with Uber, I think more and more, I mean, a lot of people have been really nervous about Uber's business practices for a number of years now. And yes, okay, they've had the worst couple of weeks in PR history, and a lot of this stuff has been bubbling under for years now. But it comes down to, at the end of the day, do you trust the company? And the company and Uber has made a number of questionable decisions and a number of questionable statements just in the last week, which I think really undermine that trust. We're seeing a real knock-on effect. We're now getting, as we pointed out in our article, we used to be so-and-so is the Uber of such and such, and now we're getting press releases of so-and-so is the Lyft of such and such. I do feel that this company is in more serious trouble than perhaps it realizes. When you get your CEO going on Twitter and saying, as a 40-year-old man, I need to grow up a bit. And, it's like, everyone's just like, well, why haven't you already? And a large proportion of certainly our readers was just like, what a wanker. I mean, this guy just has no self-awareness at all, it seems. Then you've got the sexism coming in. They're being sued by Google for stealing intellectual property. It's just been one thing after another, after another, after another. And then the analysis of their business model, which shows that basically venture capitalists are buying all Uber users, a large chunk of their ride, and Uber isn't making any money out of them. There are now some serious questions about Uber's long-term survivability. And everyone's like, oh, it's a $70 billion company. I think that valuation is seriously under question at the moment.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up trust and why it's so important. And Jason, you compared it to Google and asked, don't all these companies do this? And I'm reading Brad Stone's book, The Upstarts, which is about Uber and Airbnb, and it's a fascinating read. I'd definitely recommend it. And what his point is that as opposed to Google and Facebook, that this was our data, this was our information, but with Uber and Airbnb and companies like that, it's our bodies that they're moving around, our physical bodies, or storing them in hotels, or it's our being, which is very different. And we've talked a bunch of times about how we hand over all of this information to Google or Apple, and we hand it over easily, but it's we can't see it. But it's very different when there's a company that we're driving around in a car or staying in a hotel. That's where the difference is. And I think that, Mark Zuckerberg he wasn't Travis Kalanick exactly, but he had some really, character traits that he's grown a little bit out of. But, they weren't the best in the beginning. But it didn't matter as much. But this is when we're talking about our physical being, I think that's what the difference.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, the early days of Facebook really were playing fast and loose with an awful lot of things, and he said some really quite unpleasant things. But he was young and he was cocky and he was an upstart, and he got away with it to an extent. And Facebook cleaned up its act. It's got to be said. I mean, from what we read about the early days when it was purely a university operation, there really were some quite shocking privacy abuses. But I take your point. When it is your personal, when it is your body getting into a car with a complete stranger or staying at someone's spare room, then people get a lot more twitchy about it. I'm personally a little bit surprised that more people aren't concerned about about internet histories and browser data collections. But as you say, when it's you yourself who are putting yourself in the company's hands, that does make a phenomenal amount of difference to the levels of trust that you require in order to get that company on side.
Well, Iain, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Iain Thomson is a reporter at the Register, a frequent guest on This Week in Tech and on the Screensavers. He was on last week. Check out that episode. And he is at Iain Thomson on Twitter. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Iain.
It was a pleasure. Have a great day.
Great to see you. We'll talk to you soon.